Historians of Reddit, what is the strangest chain of events you have studied? The British government wanted to get rid of the cobras in India, so they started offering money for dead cobras. To take advantage of this, many people started breeding cobras to kill for the money, so they stopped buying dead cobras once they realized it was going on. All of the cobra breeders released the snakes and there ended up being even more cobras than there had been in the first place. Something similar happened in the area around Fort Benning, Georgia with a wild boar bounty program, which resulted in an increase in boar population. Recent history, but it still boggles my mind. Jerry Ryan gets cast on Star Trek, Voyager as 7 of 9. Jerry Ryan divorces her husband, her ex-husband, Jack, with a really strong resume and a lot of money, announces a Senate campaign in the state of Illinois in 2004. His entry in the race is enough that it is now considered a toss-up. Because both Jerry and Jack are public figures, journalists push for their divorce records to be released, and a major factor in their split was Jack's desire to have sex in public locations. Jack Ryan drops out, and the GOP struggles to find a replacement. This leads to an overwhelming victory from the Democratic challenger, Barack Obama. The entire Obama presidency exists because some writers in the 90s wanted a big titty Borg girl in their show. Probably how Pepsi briefly became the 6th largest military in the world. In 1959, President Eisenhower wanted to show the Soviet Union how great America was, so the government set up an American National Exhibition and sent Vice President Nixon there. Well, Nixon and Soviet leader Khrushchev got in an argument over communism vs capitalism. As it got heated, the president of Pepsi stepped in and was like, "Bro Khrushchev, chill out, have a Pepsi." Khrushchev must have loved that shit, because then the Soviet Union wanted to permanently bring Pepsi over to their country. The problem is that their money wasn't accepted throughout the world. Instead, like true Russians, the Soviet Union traded vodka for Pepsi. This was all good until the late 1980s, when their contract was going to expire, and vodka wouldn't cut it for payment. So instead they traded Pepsi a fuckton of submarines and warships for $3 billion worth of Pepsi. Sadly, instead of terrorizing the seas and shooting harpoons at their enemies, Pepsi decided to sell the fleet to a Swedish scrap metal company. The Miranda Supreme Court decision is one of the best. His case make it so that when you are arrested the police have to tell you your rights, and it became a staple of American TV. What most people do not know is that Ernesto Miranda, the defendant in the case, was a crappy guy, and about 20 years later he was playing poker illegally in a basement of a bar. He got was cheating, and when the people he was playing with found out, they stabbed him with a knife, killing him. The first thing the police did when they arrested the guy that killed Ernesto Miranda was read him his Miranda rights. During the Black Plague, people thought the cats were spreading the disease. They then killed all the cats. The problem is that the cats killed rats, the real source of the plague. The plague now spread faster. Fun fact, fleas were the actual source of plague transmission. Rats and other animals carried the fleas. I only remember this because of a song I heard called Fleas on Rats. Thanks for remind me of it. The Persian leader Cambyses II using cats to defeat an Egyptian army is pretty strange. He had his soldiers paint the goddess Bastard, who was cat-like in appearance, on their shields, and ranged before his frontline dogs, sheep, cats, ibises and whatever other animals the Egyptians hold dear. The Egyptians, seeing the shields and sacred animals, refused to fight out of fear of injuring them. Because of their refusal to fight, they were easily defeated and actually massacred to where their bones were still scattered across the sands years later. President Andrew Jackson was walking out of the Capitol building with his buddy Senator Davy Crockett. A man approached them, drew a gun, but it misfired. The man drew a second gun, which also misfired. Andrew Jackson, fairly old at this point, lifted his cane and began beating the would-be assassin. Normally, people would react with justice served, but Jackson was beating him so badly that Davy Crockett had to pull Jackson off his would-be assassin, who was arrested shortly after. The would-be assassin stood trial, represented by lawyer Francis Scott Key, author of the Star-Spangled Banner, and was the first American to be found not guilty by reason of insanity. This reads like some shitty American-themed woof and fiction. I'm surprised no one mentioned how Henry VIII changed the religion of England because he wanted to divorce his wife and get into the panties of a girl. Anne Boleyn, my favorite mistress wife of Henry VIII. Not a historian, but the current Hong Kong situation is all caused by a murder. A man suspected his GF of cheating while on trip to Taiwan. The man then killed his GF and flee back to Hong Kong. Since there's no extradition arrangement between HK and Taiwan, the HK government introduced a bill that would allow the HK government to extradite any criminals to not just Taiwan, but also mainland China. This has led to people protesting in Hong Kong for more than 3 months now. An ongoing crisis that has caused more than 700 people arrested and 5 people died from committing a suicide. Wasn't the bill also written in such a way that things that aren't illegal in HK but are in China could be theoretically used by China to extradite HK citizens? Yes, that's where the controversy lies. It is extradition on the basis of breaking foreign laws, and no exemption is given to allow or facilitate HK refusing to extradite. Nixon created a chain of events that I find hard to believe. So in 1968 Lyndon Johnson is president, as a Democrat, and the Democrats are having issues. The party is majorly split up between segregation issues, and they hate the Vietnam War that the country is stuck in. Nixon starts promising to end the draft, and he also proclaimed that he had a plan to end the war. Just before the election that year, on Halloween, a Thursday, LBJ gets on the news and declares that the war is almost over and peace is at hand. The North Vietnamese were participating in peace talks, and all war activity had been suspended. They left the peace talks because Nixon himself told them that if they kept the war going for 1 extra week, he would offer them a better deal once he was in power. So by Saturday, the North Vietnamese had walked out of the peace talks, and the war was back on. The election on the next Tuesday went to Nixon, but barely. The war continued for another 5 years, and in that time 15k Americans died, as well as who knows how many Vietnamese. LBJ knew about it at the time because he had wiretapped the South Vietnamese ambassador as well as several others, and felt he could not reveal the extent of the wiretapping that Americans were guilty of, even if it meant Nixon got away with treason. We learnt about this at school. In the 1950s in Borneo they were suffering from an outbreak of malaria, so, with the help of the World Health Organization, they sprayed DDT all over the island to kill the mosquitoes. But the DDT also killed the island's wasps, which helped control the population of thatch-eating caterpillars, thatch that people's homes were made of, and thanks to this, their roofs began to collapse. Many other small insects started to get affected by the DDT, which were eaten by geckos. The geckos developed a tolerance to the DDT, but the cats who ate the geckos didn't, and the cat population started to die off. This led to the island's rat population to increase greatly. And that's the story of how an island with a malaria problem led to cats being airdropped into Borneo. I remember how King Henry I was returning to England. He allowed his only legitimate son, next in line for the crown, his half-brother and sister, and a bunch of really important people, to ferry back with the guy who offered to sail the king back, while the king went back on his own. After they all get drunk, the boat crashes, and only some random survived. This caused a civil war between England and Normandy for 18 years, 1135 to 1153. According to Wikia, chroniclers described this as a period in which Christ and his saints were asleep. The original Cuban Revolution comes to mind. The first Cuban rebellion was due to the descendants of Spanish-born colonists rebelling against Spain. That revolution failed and many of them were stripped of their properties, which were seized by the victors. Fast forward 10 to 15 years and another rebellion breaks out, but this time includes freed slaves. The Americans came in at the end of the campaign and the revolution succeeded. The next 50 years saw American economic domination, which led to a series of corrupt and somewhat ineffective governments, which led to the Castro Revolution. The Spanish-American War, set ablaze by a faulty boiler aboard the light battleship Usmain, that caused a large explosion, sending the Maine to the bottom of Havana Harbor, thought to be caused by a mine, had some influence on Cuban politics as well. After the war, the US had territories as far away as the South Pacific. There was a lot of chain reactions going on, up to and including a nuclear chain reaction. that destroyed an island atoll called Bikini, which, as you have already guessed, is where the latest swimsuit that we know and love got its name. I just told this story on another sub, but the story of Arlington National Cemetery is a strange one indeed. Arlington Plantation, originally settled by none other than George Washington's adopted son, George Washington Parke Custis. He built the ornate mansion as a tribute to George Washington, creating a museum, or first presidential library. His heir Mary Custis married up-and-coming West Point grad, Robert E. Lee. During the Civil War, the Lees evacuated Arlington, and it was seized by the Union for unpaid taxes, a total of $91. Mary Lee had sent payment via courier, but the payment was refused as they wanted her to pay in person, which wasn't going to happen during the war. The Union began burying their war dead in Lee's front yard, so that every day Lee would be forced to realize the damage he'd done to his former country. After the war, the Lees sued the federal government in order to regain ownership of Arlington Plantation. The suit took many years to play out and ended in the US Supreme Court, favoring the Lees' complaint. The Lees has passed in the interim. The heir to the Lees estate, Robert E. Lee Jr., who actually had S brother named George Washington Custis Lee, had no interest in trying to re-establish the plantation at Arlington. Thousands of graves in the front yard may have been a deterrent. Therefore he offered to sell Arlington to the federal government, which accepted the offer. As luck would have it, then Secretary of War, now the Secretary of Defense, Robert Todd Lincoln, the son of Abraham and Mary Todd Lincoln, presented a check, about $100,000, to Robert E. Lee Jr. to settle the matter once and for all. How's that for a Reconciliation Act and beginning of reconstruction of our Union? The start of World War I is a good one. Assassination setting off a chain of events that eventually led to an entire continent becoming engulfed in war. Texas is another interesting one in light of today's political climate. Was part of Mexico that a bunch of Americans immigrated to, mostly illegally, but by Mexican law they were not allowed to own slaves. So they got really mad and rebelled from Mexico so that they could keep owning slaves, and then formed Texas, which eventually became part of the US. The 3 defenestrations of Prague. Such an oddly specific thing to happen on so many occasions. Sometimes you just gotta yeet some dudes out some windows. Not a historian, but the story of the Romano-Gallic Emperor Tetricus is a fun one. The guy was made emperor of the Gallic Empire, which succeeded from Rome during the crisis of the 3rd century. The previous emperor was murdered by a jealous soldier because his wife was having an affair with said emperor. Anyways, the emperor's mum decided Tetricus should become the new guy, so she bribed the army to declare him as emperor. Tetricus was not present for the ceremony and would later surrender the Gallic Empire to Aurelian, emperor of the actual Roman Empire. The independence process of Latin American countries, where it wasn't the local natives revealing against the crown, it was Latino-born Spanish men that were fed up with the crown, so they fought for the independence of the colony. That's essentially how the US did it as well. It's a fairly common story, historically speaking. If Gavrilo Princip never stopped for a snack at that cafe, he never would have shot Franz Ferdinand. That would have never started WWI with the particular political alliances of the moment, which meant Russia wouldn't have been ground into dust by Germany economically while Germany lost the war, which means communism never would have taken hold in Russia, while Nazism wouldn't even exist, which means WWI and the Cold War would have never happened. No Cold War means no American involvement in Vietnam, which led to the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. Hippies. Disgusting dirty hippies. Ferdinand's assassination is interesting because he was pretty chill toward the Serbs. But the Black Hand wanted a revolution, and you can't have a revolution if everyone is happy now, can you? Anyway, good stuff. Fucking hippies. I don't know if this is for here, but I always found it funny. The name Dimitri is very popular in the Slavic world. Like top 5 popular. It honors a saint. Most of Orthodox names honor some saint. This saint was a Greek who was a martyr and patron saint of Thessaloniki. When the Slavic tribes attacked the city many times over history, the locals fought under his banner. The Slavs never conquered Thessaloniki. Bronze Age apocalypse. The fact that there is an agreed upon apocalypse or collapse that we've gone through as a human race I think is just wild. Civilizations fell like dominoes, one after another. If my memory serves me right, we're not entirely too sure what exactly happens, but that the current popular theory is a series of crazy natural disasters followed by the mysterious sea people wrecking everybody except the Egyptians, who are still severely crippled after fighting them. A Chinese man wanted to create a potion to become immortal. Instead he accidentally created gunpowder and made fireworks. IMO Rise of Islam. So it started as an old man Muhammad who claimed to have got a message from God. He starts preaching and gets thrown out of the city for heresy. He moves to another where people are move accepting. However, he got stuck in there for years. Eventually, after a series of wars and battles, Muhammad conquers and enslaves most of tribes in Arabia, creating the first united Arabic state. However, while this was going on, in the north Byzantine and Persian empires have fought a series of wars which lasted for decades. These wars totally devastated the landscape, leaving it depopulated and very poor. This situation allowed this Arabic state, a very obscure and negligible tribal confederation, to conquer entirety of Middle East, completely absorbing the Persian Empire and conquering 70% of Byzantine Empire, practically unopposed. If these events had not transpired in such fashion, then Islam would most likely remain an obscure and minor religion focused primarily in Arabia, and Middle East would remain majority Christian and Zoroastrian. Now that would be an interesting alternate history to see. As a boxing historian, probably the story of an ancient Greek boxer named Cleomenes apparently won in the Olympic final. He killed his opponent by stabbing his fingers into his opponent's chest, killing him, which means he loses due to a strange and awesome rule was, if your opponent was killed by the fight, he automatically won. So despite surviving the fight, Cleomenes is judged the loser. No glory or olive wreath. Returns home to Astypalaia and lapses into deep depression. Commits the first mass murder of schoolchildren after punching a support beam so hard the school fell down. All the kids die. Angry mob forms to kill Cleomenes, who takes shelter in a giant chest in the temple of Athena. Townsfolk storm the temple and try to pry open the chest. End up having to rip it apart board by board. But when they got it open there was nothing in it. Naturally the people didn't know what to make of it. So they sent people to the Oracle of Delphi, who declared that Cleomenes was the last true Astypalaian, and that he be worshipped as a demigod. That is how an Olympic boxer became a deity of fertility after murdering a ton of kids. Royal family ain't got shit on ancient Greek crazy. In 1918, British MP Noel Pemberton Boleyn caused a major scandal when he accused actress Maud Allen and the wife of the previous Prime Minister Margaret Asquith of being at the center of a homosexual ring sabotaging the war effort. Evidence included Allen having performed in a play by Oscar Wilde and Asquith having attended the performance. He presented his case in an article entitled The Cult of the Clitoris, in which he claimed the exiled Prince of Albania had a black book listing all the blackmailed homosexuals in Britain. Maud Allen, who was in fact homosexual, Asquith was not, sued for libel, but lost. During the trial, one witness claimed to have seen the Albanian prince's black book and claimed that the judge's name was in it. That ending is basically a big no-you. Pretty much the fall of the Berlin Wall. The USSR was already crumbling by this point, and so they agreed to allow the wall to be opened for a bit. Well, the guy in charge over in Berlin didn't really get the point across to the public very well, and as a result everyone assumed that the wall was permanently coming down. This led to pretty much all of East Berlin flocking to the wall and demanding to be let through. The guards there knew there was no way to restrain all these people without a massacre occurring, and the Russian government had no real way of easily fixing the huge mistake. And so the Berlin Wall fell, all because of misinterpretation. One of my earliest memories watching it being pulled apart and people celebrating, and random David Hasselhoff. The events that led and culminated in the War of the Bucket for sure. Essentially one Italian state who followed Holy Roman Emperor stole a bucket from another Italian state who followed the Pope. War broke out. The papal state highly outnumbered the HRE state, but HRE state won. Then stole another bucket. Was a trip for sure when I learned about this one. The bucket is on display in a museum in one of the cities involved. Medina citizen here. I saw the bucket. Suck it, Polona. Also, not a museum, but the city's Gothic bell tower. Horses evolved in North America, spread during prehistorical times into Asia, and then later went extinct in North America. If things had been only slightly different, horses could have been native only to the Americas, or just completely extinct by prehistory. Not having horses would have made a huge difference to Asian and European history. No Mongol invasions, no European knights. Arab Spring is recent history, but still history. Mohamed Bouazizi, a Tunisian street vendor, has his wares confiscated. Unable to combat the police, he goes to the local governor to ask for his wares back, but is refused even a meeting. In response, Bouazizi sets himself on fire in public. It's not the sole reason, but certainly the catalyst for the Arab Spring, which includes civil war in many countries, leaders being ousted, and in cases like Gaddafi, executed. It sees a rise in ISIS, terrorist acts in the Western world, and other conflicts that remain active to this day, all because the police wouldn't give Bouazizi his weighing scales back. Okay guys, don't forget to hit that sub button, also ring that shiny bell, like and share too, and check out other videos in our channel.